Okay, class. Today we're going to look a little deeper into slavery and how it became embedded in the South and how it brought us to the Civil War. Now, in the South, it was all about cotton is king. Cotton was the major revenue of the South. Um, this is the revenue maker for the South and the North, who's shipping these products off to England. And the North and the South are connected through cotton. And, it got to a certain point where like 75% of England's cotton came from the South. And about 20%, of England's workers actually worked in the textile industry. So this drove, Great Britain's industry. And so this is one of the things later when the South rebels is that they feel like they'll be able to, fund a war and all that and get maybe Britain's side because they were so interconnected. And this is like they put all their hopes and dreams in. And what was also developing in the South is this concept of aristocracy, almost like royalty. Now, there weren't, of all the people in the South, there was only a few people that owned a lot of slaves. And those were the upper class, very wealthy planter aristocracy. They educated their kids in places far off, most expensive schools. They held all the wealth in the South, and it was kind of like an aristocracy, almost like a royalty going back to England. But what it really was doing in reality, if you lived in the South, is it created a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And because not a lot of people could, afford a lot to give back into the government as far as through taxation, and these guys became like they hoarded all the money, they weren't as taxed. And, basically you're setting up a system like feudalism all over again. And when you look at, it's not just like the slaves working out in the fields, it's also those working in the inside the plantations, working closely with the women. The women had huge households to, workers to cook, clean, take care of kids, everything. And that was pretty much their realm. They ran that part, and the husbands ran the outside part. But, really, one of the things is that plantation life has to deal with is also the fact that, you're embedded in the earth. And if you don't know how to take care of the earth, it destroys the soil, and you can lose your investment, or forces you to make bigger investments in hopes that won't happen. And this is, one of the fallacies of just creating a mono economy. And in this mono economy, any little change to that one thing, can destroy your livelihood. Like you can think like, I'm going to get 100 more acres, I'm going to be able to grow this much, so I'm going to invest in buying all this land, invest in buying all these slaves, and then, a disease hits and wipes out your slaves, or there's a crop failure. And, it was a very, very iffy product. But those, who could, especially the bigger owners, the bigger cotton plantations, they could take little hits. But the smaller ones were the ones that would go under and then, of course, be absorbed into these bigger ones. And the price fluctuated depending on how much there was demand in the world. And they were shipping to Great Britain quite well. But, if something went wrong in Great Britain and their economy, maybe they don't buy as much. And, there's all kinds of question marks in this whole, concept of King Cotton. Now, when you look at immigrants, there is a large-scale immigrants coming into the United States, but most of them are settling in the North. The South is pretty much, it doesn't have a big, mixture of peoples. It's mostly, the same Southerners that have been there for a long time. And the new immigrants that were coming in really couldn't find work in the South anyway, because there was no work to be had, because they already had free labor, they had slaves. So in a sense, the South got whiter and whiter minus its slaves, and the North got more cosmopolitan with people from all over Europe, different parts of Europe. Now, there were, most people, if they could afford, they could afford maybe a slave or two. It was the larger families that could afford like, hundreds of slaves. And those that usually only had one or two, is probably a small farm. And in a sense, and sadly, it was a sign of prestige. And so here you can look at a chart like who owned 100 more slaves and then who owned like one each or 2 to 4. And you can see how it reduces down. And it's that little corner at the top that controls the rest of the economy and controls the rest of the South. And one thing about like being a non-slave owner, that didn't mean like I could, I don't support slavery. In most cases, it meant that I just can't afford a slave. But this whole idea of eventually saving enough money to buy a slave, to have that kind of prestige, was ingrained in a lot of these people's minds. And this whole idea and concept of racial superiority gets planted in these minds, because this is what you need to maintain a support for a system that really only helps a small group of people. And then when we go to war, the Civil War, you're looking at 60,000 dead. How do you convince these people to give their lives for something they would never own? And this idea that, we must maintain this racial hierarchy, this idea, concept of racial superiority. And we're still dealing with it to this day. Now, there was one small group of white people that lived in the South that didn't fall into any of those categories. These are people that lived up in the mountains, mountain people. They really lived away from everybody. They had really small communities. They didn't own slaves. They didn't, they were very, very independent-minded people who didn't just go with the flow. And honestly, they did not support the South. They were the pockets that actually, either ignored the Confederacy or outright fought against the Confederacy. There were, areas in the South that actually seceded from the Confederacy. There's a film called Free State of Jones about one of them. And, these guys were, a different lot in compared to the rest of the South. They didn't fall for, this racial hierarchy and all these other things. They pretty much just wanted to be left alone. And they believed in America, and they didn't want it dissolved. So they did not fall for the Confederacy. And like I said, they offered a lot of support to the Union forces. And here you can see the growth of production and the growth of slave areas in the maps as they grew in time from 1820 to 1860, right before the Civil War. And you see the concentrations of plantations and slaves. And this area, the darker you look at in the map from 1820 to 1860, the really dark areas are the areas where you have the most concentration of slaves. And you can see how slowly, like, the whole area really converts itself economically into this whole cotton producing region, which demands a lot of slaves. Now, there were some free blacks at the time, but the thing about free blacks back then, as the South got tighter and tighter on its restrictions of slavery and fought to keep slavery, the idea of freeing slaves became less and less and less. And so a lot of these people, even though they were free, they considered almost like a third race. They could walk around, but there was a lot of things they couldn't be. There's a lot of things they could not do. And they're always, in the danger of being hijacked and re-enslaved by people who just didn't want to believe their papers, and, who was going to stand up for them. So they lived in a gray area and in a very dangerous area in the South. And a lot of states, in order to get rid of this idea that slaves could actually be free, start to shut their doors to free blacks. They wanted them out of the state. They denied everything they could from them to force them out. And so a lot of them move out of the South and end up in the North. So this concept of, working your way to to freedom and stuff slowly disappears and dwindles for African Americans in the South. And what you have also going on in the South is, like, by 1807, Great Britain has abolished the slave trade. So they have a whole fleet out there in the ocean trying to stop slave ships, but somehow like 4 million still make it across the ocean. And in America, since the importation has become illegal, they would the price of slaves would go up to the point where, people were still smuggling them in from outside because it made them so much money. This is when I referred to last time that a lot of people are using Texas as a place to sneak slaves in so they can make a profit. So we had this huge black market internal slave trade. And to be honest, it's really hard to tell like who came in legally and who didn't. And so, this is the area they worked in. And then as far as like the wealth of the South, by 1860, the capital for the South, they had $2 billion worth of capital, which is like their profit, their worth but it was all in slavery. So you can imagine saying like, I'm worth $2 billion. And if they free slaves, now you're worth like $1,000. And you can see how well they tied their economy into slavery. And of course you had, like, we were making our own slaves, and some women were forced by their masters, through rape and stuff to keep producing more and more babies. In fact, it was like a sign when they would sell, oh, she's a good breeder. And of course, when you needed money or you were looking to make a profit from this breeding, of course, there was the slave market, the auction house. And it really, it is one of the most, horrible things to see, like, people on sale. And this is highlighted in Harry Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is where people could really see the cruelty of slavery. The cruelty of what it was like if you were to pass by one of those slave markets. It was in your face what we were doing to other people. Now, slaves were, no rights, hard work all the time, no real protections at all from anything. Anyone who really tried to stand up or misbehave or whatever were sent to breakers to literally break their spirit. By 1860, the South had become, the Deep South had just become, this is where all the slaves are concentrated. This is the area where, you didn't see any free blacks for sure, but this is where the area where, slavery was concentrated. And this is the area where slavery was just part and parcel of the Southern economy. And most of these slaves are concentrated in plantations of 20 or more. In this area, literally the population, 75% of it was African American. And this is why a lot of times they fought for the 3/5 compromise, because they had huge populations, but most of that population was slaves. Slaves did their best. I mean, you're stuck in the situation, and they did their best to have some sort of family life, but that was always held over your head that, like, if the master needs some money at any point, they could sell off your children. In fact, this sometimes could be a threat held over a slave's head who became particularly rebellious or protective. We could sell off your kids, we could sell off your husband. And, a lot of times this is like, the thing that's over their head when they're afraid of what might happen if they stood up or they did something wrong. And it was this constant state of fear. But even in that constant state of fear, they tried their best to have some sort of community, some sort of family, some way to have some sort of life as it could be in the South. A lot of them, part of it was to justify their position. They were Christianized, but the Psalms and stuff and the parts of the Bible that were presented to them were usually things that talked about being a good slave to your master and so forth. But, and then in Christianity, what they were being sold is the fact that, okay, you're going to be a slave here. When you go to heaven, things will be better. Just wait till heaven. And the other thing about the church, and it's still, crucial to this day, is the church was very important in slave life and African life because it was the one place they could actually gather together in groups and have meetings and talk to each other. Because in any other setting, they would think you're planning insurrection and break it up and beat people or even lynch them. So this is the one place where they could be around each other in large groups and, in a sense, be semi-free. So this is why the church has played a major role in African American life. Now, well, I think I spoke about this before. Slaves did their best to make what they could. And a lot of times, their way of rebellion was a little subversive, but it worked. You work real slow. Like, what am I going to get out of it? Work fast, breaking tools, doing whatever they can just to make their lives easier. It's like, I really don't feel like putting up the fence today. Let's break the hammer. Let's do this. Let's do that. And it was what they could do in the positions that they were in. And in time, as especially once the existence of the Underground Railroad, slaves did run away. Others rebelled. There was several marked rebellions in the South. The most famous of which is Nat Turner, because his rebellion was the most prolific, killing over 60 people until eventually they were all him and his followers are found and let and hung in places so all the slaves could see what would happen to you if you tried to rebel. Now, one interesting case that comes to the courts is the case of the Amistad. The Amistad was a ship that was a slave ship, even though slavery was the slave trade was outlawed by this point. The slaves rebelled, and this is just showing an example of how slaves did continue to resist. They rebelled, they took hold of the Amistad, made their way to the United States, and there's this huge court case on who they are, and, are they, guilty of murder and so forth. John Quincy Adams defends them, and in the end, they actually do get off. But this idea, the stories like these, barbaric people that rose up and killed the slave ship captain, that's what the whites would concentrate on, especially. There were different societies that started to organize who saw slavery as just a moral ill. It starts with the Quakers, and this is where you first get the first abolitionist societies. There's also the American Colonization Society, 1817, that begins to transport slaves back to Africa for their freedom. This is where the country of Liberia comes from. But for many Africans, they're second, third generation Americans. They've been living here for so long. Africa's a strange place. It's a place they don't even speak the language, and a lot of them weren't willing to move. They just wanted, freedom, dignity, respect. They wanted to be treated as a human being. And they didn't feel like they had to move, to do that. Now, some of the early big-time abolitionists start in Great Britain. That's why Great Britain was one of the first places to abolish slavery. William Wilberforce is a member of Parliament who pushes. He's a reformer, Christian reformer, and he pushes to finally get Great Britain to outlaw slavery. You had Theodore Weld, who was he tried to go and preach to the rural people, the people that would have maybe none or a few slaves, and try to teach them, through God's eyes, that this is wrong. He had a little pamphlet he would pass out, and a lot of compelling arguments, though, get really put forth in Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a book that has a major impact in American history. And for those that didn't read, it was turned into a famous play. And the fact that at some point in the South it gets banned altogether, you could read it or see it, because this is how impactful this novel was. Now, just go ahead and move forward. Now, one of the in the United States, another great abolitionist who had access to a newspaper called The Liberator was William Lloyd Garrison. He was a fiery, made fiery speeches against the evils of slavery. And these guys are the ones that later support the Underground Railroad. There was also free blacks like David Walker, Sojourner Truth, and Martin Delany, who either made speeches, toured through the United States, wrote books, or talked. And like Martin Delany was one of the few that talked about going back, to Africa. Now, one of the most famous ones, of course, is Frederick Douglass, who was himself a slave, escaped, taught himself to read and write. He goes on to write his narrative of life of Frederick Douglass and reads sections and travels throughout the United States, giving speeches and orations, about the evils of slavery and how America needs to bring them to an end. And he becomes very famous because he is widely traveled and widely read in the North. And Garrison, like I said earlier, he was a fiery speech maker who actually at one point burned the Constitution because in there was slavery, and that was just evil. It was a covenant with the devil. And this guy was just like out loud and just like, would not take slavery in any form, and just talked about it being the disease of the United States. Now, as there were a lot of anti-slavery societies in the North, but of course not any. And then the few that were immediately crushed in the South. And as this movement in the North got louder and louder, the South tightened things in the South, especially when it came to slavery. Like, we're no more free blacks. We're tightening the codes, restricting movement of slaves, and just trying to make sure they don't get any idea of trying to liberate themselves. And these rebellions, especially Nat Turner, fed into these fears that you better get a hold of your slaves because look what Nat Turner was able to do. And so any talk of insurrection or anything was immediately dealt with either lynchings or horrible beatings in front of the slaves. Now, those that tried their best to rationalize slavery would talk about how well they treated their slaves, that they're happy, we provide everything they need, this is a good relationship, a fatherly relationship. And it's just their way of trying to justify the horrible acts they're committing. In the South, it got to the point where they were so scared of abolition or the end of slavery that in Congress they actually pushed forth the gag resolution, which meant you couldn't even use the word slavery when you debated in Congress. You couldn't bring it up at all. So in a sense, like, this ended the compromise that maybe could have saved things. Now they couldn't even discuss it. They couldn't talk about it. And this is kind of limited what was going to happen to bring about the end of slavery. Now, in truth, the North had a huge tie-in with slavery because they wanted that cotton. A lot of them didn't care how they were getting that cotton. They just needed it coming in large numbers because that's where their money was, and they want anything to slow it down. So in a sense, they were tied to slavery, even though they didn't work, use slaves. They used cheap immigrant labor, but really, they just wanted that cotton coming. They didn't care less how that cotton got there. And so even in the North, abolitionists would face violent attacks, retribution, houses put on fire, because, it was not just the South that were okay with slavery. Like I said, there were people in the North that were okay with it as well. A lot of people's business was tied into it, even though they didn't directly own slaves.